Okay, just continuing from where I left the last video. So black had played d6, Kasparov played d6. Obviously now we can see this bishop has some freedom here and some squares to go to, which is good. In general, the bishops of the dark square of the side playing black is tricky to place. It's difficult to decide exactly where to place them. They have a lot of options. Black has a lot of options in this position. But there are a few general strategic points, and that is that generally this knight looks to go to the a5 square to attack this bishop, and actually we can see at the moment this bishop doesn't really have any squares to go to. We could bring it to d5, this isn't very good. Maybe capture this pawn, but it's like there's no solid compensation for such a sacrifice. So generally we see the move c3, so obviously the bishop now has a square to go to. And this does take away this square for the knight, because obviously development's important, but usually this knight doesn't belong on this square, so it's not considered such an issue. And just looking back into some of the earlier moves, black doesn't have to necessarily right away play the move knight e5, so there are certain positions where black can play this move, but it's not completely necessary. And there are some stronger moves, and again in this position it's necessary for black to defend this pawn before moving the knight, because obviously black wants to move the knight, but at the moment it would leave that pawn undefended. So we see c3, castles, and then h3, and the idea of this move is just to prevent this bishop from coming down to g4, which would be unpleasant for white, because this knight is kind of, white wants to push d4, and if the knight is getting kicked, harassed, then it can't do its job as well. Obviously this knight will be pinned to the queen once the bishop comes down, and this bishop would become an active piece. It would have a job to do, so rather than just be on kind of some random squares. So that's why we see h3 first before white commits to playing d4. h6, which again is, Kasparov in general really wants to play a really passive game and just sort of try and achieve a sort of strategic advantage over the computer. d6 is an example of kind of a very quiet move that is not a weak move, but it's not a very initiative move. I mean, black I think could straight away play knight to a5 here with the idea of pushing c5. So obviously black is now gaining control over the wing on the queen's side. So now we see d4, which is white's plan, and then rook to e8. The idea here is that this bishop's just going to be moved. We've got this little maneuver just so the rook is becoming active. In general, the dark square bishop for black doesn't have a huge amount of activity, and usually is better kind of sitting on f8 and just defending some squares around the king. So here we see knight to d2. Now obviously immediately it's blocking this bishop from its diagonal, from its potential, but this knight, his objective is actually to move around the board to superior squares. So generally these strategical positions, it's going to be more about controlling squares and finding the right places for pieces. And because this knight's going to be moving, it isn't necessary for the moment for this bishop to have any, it has no tactical purpose to be on this diagonal, so for the moment there's no problem. So we see the bishop just retracting, just unblocking this line here for the rook, and then knight to f1, so the knight is going to travel to g5 where it has some squares to look at, so obviously some weak squares on the black side. And then Kasparov decided, in this position there are many options for black. Kasparov decided to place his bishop on d7, and then we see knight to g3 as discussed, and then finally we see black realizing his plan at this position, so attacking the bishop, so the bishop has to go retreat back, and we actually saw that the bishop kind of, we brought it to b5, a4, and we brought it all the way back, so it's kind of like, if you don't, whilst playing a4 is tactically it's a very sound move, we can see that this bishop kind of, its function is somewhat undermined, which is perhaps one reason why, well, at least for me, it may be better to trade the bishop So it's kind of a personal preference thing. So the bishop move, okay, and then we see c5, and then b3, and what this move is doing is blocking off this square. This, as you can see, this knight at the moment has been transposed. We've got it out of the way so we could push our c-pawn, because it was backward as well, so we're kind of controlling a lot of squares for black here. This knight would really like to be on this square. At the moment that's now impossible because of b3. We see this bishop has a few extra opportunities on some different diagonals. If black does a nothing move like just, I don't know, king to h8, then white can push d5, and this knight will have to go back to b7.